Victoria's regional train network V-Line is the largest and most extensive in all of Australia, with the highest amount of operational tracks across the state. In spite of this, there are many places in northwestern Victoria V-Line trains no longer get people to. One of them is Dimboola, which, despite being one of the largest cities in Victoria's Wimmera region, hasn't seen a V-Line passenger service in 32 years. Today we're discussing why is there no more trains to Dimboola and will there be one again? Throughout the 1880s, many new regional railway lines were being opened across Victoria, one of which was Dimboola. However, the Dimboola line actually originally opened in 1875, and until 1882, it only went to as far as Ararat. But finally, on July 1st, 1882, the first regional train arrived at Dimboola, and so for the first time you could travel to and from Dimboola by train. In the 1950s, a diesel rail motor service between Dimboola and Surfeston was introduced. Passengers nicknamed this service the Peanut, others nicknamed it the Beetle. However, this service was discontinued in 1978. In 1955, a derailment happened at Dimboola turntable, where a steam locomotive fell into the turntable. The Dimboola line was being operated by a mix of B, S, and T class diesel locomotives built in the 1950s and a mix of E and S type carriages, right up until 1987 when the last of these locomotives and carriages were replaced by V-Line's brand new N class diesel locomotives and N type carriages. During the 1980s and early 90s, the Dimboola line saw 3 return passenger trains per day from Monday to Saturday, and on Sunday 2 return passenger trains per day, and the occasional freight train. Passenger trains on the Dimboola line would make stops at Stool, Horsham, and Dimboola. In 1992, an ugly monster named Jeff Kennett became the premier for Victoria, and so the Dimboola train line, along with many other V-Line lines in Victoria, were screwed. And unfortunately, on the morning of August 21st, 1993, the last ever scheduled passenger train from Dimboola left, bound for Melbourne. Many of the regional train lines in Victoria that were closed down by the Kennett government had been closed to all train traffic. However, the Dimboola line was kept operational for freight trains coming from Melbourne or Adelaide, with the Dimboola train line now closed to V-Line services between Dimboola and Ararat. The Ararat to Ballarat section of the Dimboola line would be closed a year later in 1994. In 1995, the interstate Adelaide to Melbourne line was converted from broad to standard gauge track as part of Australia's One Nation program, and because the Dimboola to Ararat line was using the same track as the Adelaide line, it was also converted to standard gauge. This had pretty much killed all the chances of returning broad gauge V-Line services back to Dimboola. The first step of returning V-Line services to Dimboola happened in 2004, when the line between Ararat and Melbourne via Ballarat was reopened to V-Line trains. Initially, upon reintroduction, services were being operated by V-Line's Sprinter rail motors. Velocity trains were introduced on the Ararat line in December of 2005. The Ararat line these days sees 4 return trains per day from Monday to Friday, and 2 return trains per day on weekends. More attempts at returning regional trains to Dimboola happened in the following years. Horsham Railway Station was upgraded at a total cost of $490,000 in 2007, and then Stool Railway Station was also upgraded in 2011. These days, these stations are served by the Overland, which runs between Melbourne and Adelaide, with 2 return services per week. But what about Dimboola's railway station? Well, ever since the Dimboola line closed to V-Line services in 1993, the Overland continues to stop at Dimboola station consistently every week. Will V-Line services to Dimboola be reintroduced? Well, in recent times there have been more and more calls to reintroduce V-Line trains to Stool, Horsham and Dimboola. Well, currently it is very unlikely, as the Dimboola line has some significant issues that could prevent V-Line from running a consistent service to and from Dimboola. Currently, V-Line's only option is to run a standard gauge service to Dimboola via Geelong, which could take 5 hours and 10 minutes, which is the same time the overland takes between Dimboola and Melbourne. A more direct route would be along the Ararat line via Ballarat. However, this line is broad gauge, and so we want V-Line trains to and from Dimboola to avoid conflict with freight trains on the line via Geelong. So, how are we going to resume V-Line broad gauge services to and from Dimboola if the tracks between Dimboola and Ararat are standard gauge? This here is the Adelaide Metro Belair line. It runs double track between Adelaide and Belair. However, the northern track is for broad gauge Adelaide Metro trains to and from Belair, and the southern track is for standard gauge freight trains. Notice how in this picture you can see the tracks at different gauges? The broad gauge Belair line is on the left, while the standard gauge Adelaide to Melbourne line is on the right. I recently designed a concept of returning broad gauge V-Line trains between Dimboola and Ararat. In this concept, we will use Adelaide Metro's method for returning broad gauge V-Line trains to Dimboola. Take a moment to pause the video and read what's written on the screen to find out how the concept will work. This concept will also involve the rebuilding of Ararat train station. This means a new third platform for broad gauge V-Lines to Dimboola will be built just north of the current standard gauge track. It's likely that after the broad gauge track between Ararat and Dimboola is completed, the current V-Line platforms just south of the standard gauge platform at Ararat will probably no longer be used regularly. We could either use it if absolutely necessary, or no longer use it at all and maybe remove it, or repurpose it into something else. The overland train between Melbourne and Adelaide will also no longer be stopping at Stawell or Horsham. This will hopefully reduce travel times on the overland by some minutes. Driving a car between Melbourne and Dimboola both ways takes a little over 3.5 hours. The broad gauge V-Line train between Dimboola and Melbourne via Ararat will take a little over 4 hours, and hopefully it'll be a competitive service against the car. So will V-Line trains to Dimboola on broad gauge track be reintroduced? Well, it is very unlikely. There are lots of challenges to face with infrastructure related stuff, and the Dimboola train line closed down for quite a few reasons, such as low ridership and high operational costs and high cost of maintenance of infrastructure. But nevertheless, I'm hoping that with the help of my proposal and the calls to return trains to Dimboola, we can ride trains to and from Dimboola on a broad gauge V-Line track, and without interference with freight trains or the overland train between Melbourne and Adelaide.